Hey everybody, this is Aaron Harris, host of the Football Odyssey, and today I want to talk to you about Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First of all, it's free. And there are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone and computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. And you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So go and download the free Anchor app or go to Anchor FM to get started.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Welcome everyone to the Football Odyssey. This is yours truly, Aaron Harris, and today I'm pleased to welcome Michael Oriard to the show. I'm sure as many of you know, Michael is a former professor at Oregon State University, as well as a retired professional football player, and is the author of several books that have touched on numerous subjects within the realm of American football and how the sport impacts America from a cultural, economic, and even artistic standpoint. His books include The End of Autumn, Reading Football, King Football, and Brand NFL. We have a wide-ranging conversation today that dives into several different topics from Michael's esteemed work, and as you'll hear, Michael's academic and even artistic view of the game is truly one of a kind, and I can't wait for you all to hear it. As always, if you enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, share, and let us know what you think on our social media accounts, which can be found in the description. That said, thank you all for listening, and now, here is Michael Oriard. All right, Michael Oriard, thank you for coming on the show today. How are you?
Good to be with you, Aaron.
It's a pleasure to meet you, and first off, big fan of your work. I've had the chance to read your essays and your books over the years. I really appreciate the artistic and the academic approach you take to analyzing the game. Sometimes it's a little hard to find, so I'm very grateful from that perspective. And I reached out to you because I actually just got done reading your first book, The End of Autumn, Reflections on My Life in Football, which was published 40 years ago this year. Yeah. And, it's one of those memoirs I always enjoy reading football memoirs, but this one was good because you really took your journey within the game from your childhood all the way to, your career through the CFL, and then how it would ultimately kind of craft your writing career and your, career as a professor. First, before we go deeper into it and your career, what was sort of the motivating factor that you had to put pen to paper and tell your football story?
Well, I had no motivation whatsoever. I mean, who would care? I was a special teams player and backup offensive lineman in Kansas City, but my teammate, you probably remember this before you were born, but I'm sure you read about it. My teammate, Jim Tyre, killed his wife and killed himself in 1980. So basically 6 years after I left the Chiefs. And it was absolutely stunning, and I wrote a piece about it that ended up being published in the New York Times, and lo and behold, I got a letter. This is back before the internet. You got actual letters from an editor at Doubleday saying, are you writing a book about your football life? I thought, no. And it just made no sense to me until I figured out in correspondence with him that, okay, so this would be the experiences of an ordinary football player. Most football memoirs are extraordinary players. They're the stars. But this would be what it's like for a regular football player. We had some success, but nothing spectacular and all that. And so that's what led me to actually write the thing.
Yeah, that's interesting because whenever I'm reading the book, it's obviously you have some memoirs about, the Hall of Famers and everything like that. And then you have sort of the tell-all, like the Bernard Parrish, David Megacy books that talk about, the underside of the game. But this one, you have a very, balanced viewpoint about, this is what football meant to me and it was great. But there were also things that were a detraction as well. And I think it was interesting how you kind of touched on both of those worlds at every level in your journey too.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have an agenda, so my challenge was to try to remember stuff.
Yeah. Now, going back to the beginning of the book, when you talk about your childhood and your introduction to the game, you talk about it in a way. You mentioned how you had played a lot of sports growing up, but football in particular had this larger than life appeal to you. There was something very grand and very heroic about it, more so than any of the other games or the sports that you had played. So, can you just sort of lay the foundation for the audience and explain, how football at an early age had an impact on your life in terms of how you viewed heroes to a child, or the relationship it had, with your father, and relationship you had with your friends growing up? I guess sort of lay the foundation for, football and how it molded your mind at such a young age.
Well, I think most fundamentally, I was a younger brother. My older brother was 19 months older. We both ended up 6'5" or so, but I was big for my age, and he was more normal. And so I sort of matched up with him physically pretty well, but I couldn't beat him at anything. And, younger brothers, are always competitive. They're always trying to beat their older brothers and all that. So somehow I grew up with, this need to prove myself that I think came from having this older brother that I could competed with all the time, but couldn't beat him at anything. For your listeners, I'm constantly reminded that at age 74, my sense of the world is very different from that of anybody, who, was born after, say, 1980 or so. This was the era of the 3 TV networks, the game of the week and all that. And so I wasn't surrounded by football, the way a kid would be today, but football was part of my world. There were Sunday games, NFL games, and my dad was working crazy hours, but we sometimes watched them together. And the only teams you saw in Spokane, Washington were either 49ers or the Rams. And I became a Rams fan because they had the cool helmets with the Ram decoration on the helmet. And Washington State was the local college, 80, 90 miles away, and they had a guy named Keith Lincoln in the 50s, a great running back. And so I just picked up the way a kid would do, the kind of the sport in the world. Baseball was the big sport. I knew all there was to know about baseball, all the statistics, and Rube Waddell and Walter Johnson, and you go back to the beginning, and I read books about these things and so on. Football wasn't like that for me, but football was where you proved yourself, and I didn't have a father I had to prove myself to, and I didn't really have a brother to prove myself to. I had myself to prove myself to, but it was, kind of driven, like I say, I think, by having this older brother. But to put a simple word on it, toughness. A kid gets this idea that, if he wants to prove to himself or to anybody else that he's tough enough, football is one of the principal places where you do it. And you do it in a safe environment. And, you're not putting your life at risk, or at least not very likely, and certainly not within your consciousness. But anyway, so, playing football, as a way to discover things about myself and to prove things about myself. I think that's the way kids used to grow up with football. Now inundated with the media and all that, you're more likely to grow up thinking you're going to make $1 million or $17 million or whatever, and you're going to play on TV. None of that was part of the world that I lived in, the football world that I lived in. But my football world was a guy named Hoppy Sebesta across the street. I was maybe 6, 7 years old, and he was a high school player at the local Jesuit high school that I was going to be going to, and he was an all-city, running back, and he was my hero. It was a much smaller scale world back then than it is now.
Yeah, that's interesting how your experience playing football kind of parallels the evolution of the media infrastructure, right? Like you look to a local hometown hero that in some regards served as a little bit of an inspiration that you wanted to live up to, as opposed to who you would see on Sundays or on Monday Night Football.
Yeah. I mean, I did see a little bit of it on TV, and I was born in 1948, and as near as I can figure, the first season that I can kind of remembering was 1958, and Billy Cannon won the Heisman Trophy for LSU, and LSU had the Chinese Bandits and all of that stuff. And like I say, there's this guy Keith Lincoln down at Washington State, but he was never on TV. Washington State didn't get on TV, but I guess already at age 10, I must have been reading sports pages because I knew who Keith Lincoln was, and so you picked your heroes where they were available to you, and you didn't know that much about them. And I think I had a tremendous advantage coming from such a simple world for football to come to mean for me what it did. If growing up today, it never would have played out the same way.
Yeah, it's just too prevalent. It's like you don't have like that imagination to kind of leave yourself in wondering. Like I had the chance to interview Upton Bell, the son of Burt Bell, a while ago, and he was talking about how great it was to like listen to the Monsters of the Midway on the radio. You didn't really have a face with the name, but you just hear the description, and it kind of gives you like that fuel for your imagination, what they would look like if you never got to see them in person.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Your imagination was much more involved, but also your imagination was limited. What you could imagine, the greatness you could imagine for yourself was rather circumscribed back then.
Yeah. Well, and it's like, even when you look at like, and you've written about this, like the pulp magazines you had from like the late 30s through the late 50s, it has like these paintings of, a fullback or a tailback carrying a football, like he's in distress, almost like it's like an action story. And it's cool to see like how like something like that, I could see a kid reading in like the 40s or in the 50s thinking about, a football hero that he looks up to that he has never seen in person, maybe hears on the radio, but he has like this image of, a larger than life image of them in his head based off like the media he sees surrounding him.
Yeah. I mean, a football star was sort of like, a cowboy. You want to grow up to be a cowboy.
Yeah.
No, you want to grow up to be a football star. They're kind of the same thing.
Right.
Or at least in your little world. Yeah.
Now, would you say that it was probably maybe like in high school in which not only the toughness part of football appealed to you, but also, the aesthetics and the artistry of the game?
Oh, no. I tapped into that a whole lot later, when I was a grown up, with a PhD from Stanford and looking for things to write about and all that sort of stuff. My world was the simpler football world that all kids in small towns like Spokane grew up in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah. Well, that's when you talk about too, about like how you had to kind of channel that fear, like you're afraid of looking like you're afraid to your teammates, which is like an interesting dynamic. Obviously you're teammates and you want to support each other, but you're also competitors in a sense. And, there's one job to be had for everyone. So you really have to kind of channel in that inner toughness and have to develop that thick skin, obviously towards the other team, but also your teammates.
Yeah. I mean, like for me, okay, so toughness was a big part of it. But like I say, it was proven to myself. And I was really fortunate that I didn't have a father that had expectations he dumped on me. I wasn't proving anything to my father. I guess I was proving to my coaches, but mostly I was proving to myself. But if the coaches didn't notice, then I needed that validation. But it, for me, football through college actually was a personal quest. Pursuit of dreams that I had that were private to myself. And like I say, I think that was to my good fortune. I don't know if the stories are quite as familiar today as they were when I was growing up, but the idea of the father who drives his son to, either duplicate what he did as a young man or do what he couldn't do as a young man. That was a part of the football world back then, but it wasn't part of my football world.
Yeah, even like I mean, I live in Florida, and down south, youth football is just as big as high school football in some parts. Like they're already doing like summer training camps at like 6, 7 years old. Um, but something that's interesting throughout the book is like there's just sort of like this overarching theme about, and some of it is obviously driven from Jim Tyer's experience about how football begins to define a person to the point where it's only their identity. And when you were in high school, you talked about how you were a really good player, but you had injury setbacks that, looking back, you would say was a blessing in disguise, right? Because it kept you like grounded in reality.
Yeah, yeah, and also too, I had the good fortune to, for me, and I don't even know if this is possible today, for a kid to get as far as I got without being wholly committed to it from early on. I grew up. I never went to a summer football camp. We didn't have, like you're talking about with youth football. We didn't have tryouts and spring training and all of that kind of stuff. Football was a really important thing in my life, but it was in my life only, and it was just a part of my life. I never had to make a commitment to football at the expense of anything else. And as long as I can remember, I suppose there was a time before then that I'm not remembering. Football was never the most important thing in my life. I always knew I was going to go to college, and once I got to college, I always knew I was going to go to graduate school, and I always knew that my real career was not going to be in football, even if football really worked out. And I think it's enormously more difficult to have that orientation today. And the danger for somebody like my teammate Jim Tyer was that football was the thing that made his life meaningful, and then it ended, and things went sideways in various ways that I don't even know all about. But his life, peaked, plateaued, and then plummeted, right? And I finished football and completed my PhD and got a teaching job and had my real career, for the next 40 years. And like I say, I don't think you get to the NFL, the way I did with football as a kind of secondary thing. It's, a happy accident that keeps happening sort of deal, right? I was really, really driven in college, but I got to a point, I was a walk-on at Notre Dame, and my career wasn't going anywhere, and I was having to think about, okay, should I continue to put all the time in on this and all that? And then I got a break, and everything worked out fine. But if I stopped playing football in college, I don't know exactly what I'd be doing, but it would entail having gotten a graduate degree in something, maybe law school. Who knows? I mean, I always had the more important alternatives to my life, and then this really private, personal crusade of my own. And I don't see how a kid could have that kind of balance these days and become an accomplished enough football player to be successful. How do you become a football player today without going to training summer camps and without taking all these lessons and all this stuff, without seriously committing yourself to this is my life's ambition, and I'm going to give everything I have to it. That's what it takes these days, and it didn't require that in my generation.
Yeah, it's almost like you really have to be a super athlete to be able to do all the other things and still be really good at one of the sports. I mean, obviously, for like offensive linemen, they may do like weightlifting in the off season or like be on the weightlifting team in high school. But I mean, that's pretty much just so they can continue their football workouts within the confines of the rules, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and weightlifting was just coming in. When I joined the Chiefs in 1970, they had the best team in the NFL. They just won the Super Bowl. And my teammates like Jim Tyer, guys who were 8, 9, 10 years old. I mean, Lenny Dawson, the quarterback, had a 19-year-old daughter, and I was 22 years old.
Yeah.
They were from a different generation,
Right.
and they never lifted weights. They were just these big, strong men, who worked construction in the summers and butt bales or did the sorts of physical labor that young guys did in summers for staying in shape. But they didn't lift. I could lift more weights than these massive offensive linemen on the team, but they were so much stronger than I was.
Yeah.
They were just man strong, instead of weight room strong.
Yeah.
But it was just starting. It was just starting in the '60s. The weight training for football players.
Yeah, I actually just did a short documentary on YouTube about Alvin Roy. Was he the coach for you when you were there?
He was the strength coach when I was there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it's funny you mentioned Billy Cannon too, because he was like one of the first people that did his programs in Baton Rouge whenever he was coming up. So that's interesting that you were there at the same time whenever the NFL was starting to go that direction as well.
But it's funny. I remember Alvin pretty well. I mean, he was I really liked him. We were kind of buddies a little bit, and I was undersized. I was like 6'5.5", and I never played at more than 242 pounds as a center, and that's inconceivable today, but it was possible then. But the other offensive linemen, on the Chiefs, we had big offensive linemen, and they were 260 and up. Tyre was 280. But that was 260 or 280 on Thursday for weigh-in, and then it was 10 pounds more by Sunday when you took off your sweat vest and went back to having a few beers and eating some food again. But I was undersized, and I tried like hell to put on weight. One year in college, I drank Metrocal, this protein supplement. 6 cans of it a day. I went to bed bloated. And put on about 15, 20 pounds and lost them the first week in training camp. I just couldn't put weight on. And so here I am, hanging out on practice field with Alvin Roy. He never once mentioned, I don't even know if I would have known what he was talking about at the time. I mean, this is only 1970. But he never mentioned steroids as something I might, hey, Mike, I got this supplement you might try. It'll help you put on weight. Never, ever, So when I read about Alvin Roy, bringing his steroids from the weightlifting world into the football world, I'm perplexed, because here I was an absolute perfect candidate for it, and he never tried to get me to take them, and I trusted my elders in those days, and I would have been susceptible. I would have likely tried it if he had proposed it, but he didn't. So I think Alvin sometimes gets more blame than he deserves for having turned so many guys onto steroids that ended up destroying their lives or whatever.
Yeah, from what I read, it kind of sounded like when he first got on with the Chargers, he had recommended it, but, once the doctors had said, hey, this is actually having an adverse effect on people, and they found out, I guess, 5 weeks after the cycle had begun, they pretty much said, no, we're not going to do this anymore. And I think, like Ron Mix and a lot of guys have said it was the actual, like, weight training program and not the steroids that contributed to their good season that year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier while you were at in college and you went to school at Notre Dame, like you said, that you had like sort of like a personal goal or a personal journey like in college that wasn't exactly that well known to other people. And it sounded like from what I read, you were also looking to do well in college, but you didn't necessarily have the dream of being a football hero like maybe some other people had. So how do you kind of like walk that line in college of wanting to compete with the best people on your team, but you also have your other academic life that you're focusing on because you're not just solely focused on football as well?
Well, I mean, again, I keep saying this, how fortunate I was, to come from my generation and the world I came from. But, I think of my college football experience as being incredibly fortunate. Okay, so I was a walk-on, and this is back before freshmen were eligible. So as a freshman at Notre Dame, we had our own freshman team, and we played 3 games, and we scrimmaged with each other, and we scrimmaged against the varsity. I lined up against Alan Page and hoped he didn't crush me and that sort of stuff. But, I was an 18-year-old kid from Spokane, Washington, thought of myself as a defensive end and weighed, I think, about 205 pounds. And I had never, in playing high school football in Spokane, seen anybody on the field who weighed over 220 who wasn't just big and fat, right? Yeah. And the smallest scholarship offensive lineman, was about 240 pounds. They all came from Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan and so on. And, it was just, oh my goodness, I'm in over my head. But, my motivation was to prove that I could play with them. And I drove myself, and, nobody could have been aware of what I was doing, but I was trying, and I actually did well. I started one of those 3 freshman games at defensive end. I just beat out the other guy by being tougher in practice, being more effective in practice and all that. But I was in kind of a separate world as a walk-on. The scholarship players, were a group that I wasn't a part of, that I was trying to become a part of. And so I was there. I'd been valedictorian of my high school class. Of course, I'm going to go to college with an academic emphasis. And I started college at Notre Dame as, an academic achiever, and that was my primary orientation. And then, in the afternoon, I'll try this football kind of stuff. And, it wasn't quite that casual. It was really important and meaningful to me. But there was never, ever any doubt which one mattered more in my long-term future, the academics or the athletics. So I was an outsider in that football world, which limited the kind of experience I could have. But at the same time, I was getting the best education that Notre Dame had to offer. And this is a generational thing too, I think. I don't know how you can play college football today without making academic sacrifices.
Right.
The NCAA's own surveys say that players put in 44, 45 hours a week on football practice, and that was 10 years ago. It's probably more than that now, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know how you can be, when I had physics labs as a freshman, I came late to practice so I could do my physics lab. That's what you did at Notre Dame in 1966, right?
Right.
I'll bet that's even hard to pull off at Notre Dame today, unlike back in 1966. So I was a student at Notre Dame playing football with this private, personal passion that was really important to me. And then, when I got my break and things changed, and all of a sudden I was a backup center beginning of my junior year, and then became a starter halfway through my junior season. It was sort of wonderful, not sort of. It was wonderful. I mean, I don't have a great memory, but I have a vivid memory of the first game I started in it would have been 1968 against Illinois at home. And, we blew them out, and Aron Parsegian, the coach, sat his starters for the fourth quarter. And I can remember sitting on the bench on the sideline, just this feeling of unbelievable satisfaction for having just played my first game as a starting center at the University of Notre Dame. I did it. I made it, that kind of feeling. But as I say, but it was always my private, personal, sort of short-term, hugely important crusade alongside, my life's ambitions,
right.
to do something in the world, right?
Well, it's also like being the fact that you played for such obviously Notre Dame doesn't have the same prestige now as it once did, but like to be able to play on the same field or for the same university as a lot of the legends in years past, that also had to feel fulfilling in its own right too.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I was a Catholic kid, grew up in Spokane, Washington, far from Notre Dame, but I'm not even sure how I picked it up back then. I knew all about Newt Rockne. I knew it when Eric Parsegan came to Notre Dame from Northwestern in 1964. I knew John Hewart had won the Heisman Trophy a few years before I got there. I knew the Notre Dame story and the mystique, and you arrive on campus as a freshman, and there's the Rockne Memorial at one end of the quad, and there's Touchdown Jesus on the 13th-story library. And, there's all of this kind of myth saturating the place. And I certainly absorbed that. And to feel a part of that was really, really, really special. It was really important to me. So I don't for a moment, want to, minimize the importance of it to me. It's just that it was never an importance totally out of whack with what had to be my lifelong plans. I knew football under the best of circumstances ends when you're 30, 35 years old. You got half your life to go, and most of your working life to go. And I was never, it wasn't that I was a preternaturally wise kid. It's just that I never had pressures put on me to make me understand anything other than that was important was school and what school led to.
Now, whenever you decided to play professional football when you were drafted by the Chiefs, was that, obviously when you have these very long-term plan in mind of wanting to teach and, continue grad school, was this still something you decided to go with just to see from a competitive standpoint how you would stack up with the best as a player? I mean, was that, because obviously at this point you were very focused on life after football, but you still decided to go through at the professional level. Is you just wanted to see as a competitor if you could hold your own?
Yeah, I mean, I had finished a kind of fairy tale experience at Notre Dame, and I was intrigued by the idea of playing professional football, and being in South Bend, Indiana, in the late '60s, and as a center. The ogre who loomed in my imagination was Dick Butkus, out there for the Bears. And I thought, if I tried to play against him, he'd kill me. But it was still professional football, and I dreamed about professional football when I was a little kid and all that kind of thing. And so if the opportunity arose, I wanted to try it. And I was a 5th round draft choice. Nobody was beating down my door to get at me, but somebody decided I was good enough to give it a shot, and I was perfectly willing to give it a shot, so long as it didn't interfere with graduate school. When I got into graduate school, if they'd told me, sorry, you either report in September or you can't be admitted, I would not have played in the NFL, but because the schools I went to were willing to allow me to come in January, it worked out ideally. And so then I arrived in Kansas City, to see how it went. And it wasn't nearly as important to me in Kansas City as it had been at Notre Dame to prove that I could make it. Whatever I needed to prove to myself about myself through football, I did at Notre Dame. In Kansas City, it was an additional, really, really interesting experience with a really interesting group of guys that I wanted to keep going as long as it can. My master plan was, okay, a PhD takes 4 years, doing it this way, going to school just 2 terms a year, let's say 6 years. So my master plan was to stay in the NFL for 6 years, retire at the same time I got my PhD, and then find a teaching job. That was the master plan. And if ever graduate school and football collided with each other, it had to be graduate school. That was the long-term plan, the long-term priority. But as long as it didn't Clyde, then I'd keep going. Well, it ended prematurely. I played only 4 because I got cut by the Chiefs at the end of the first players' strike in 1974. But unlike most NFL players who get cut, particularly if they get cut sooner than they'd anticipated, they have this great uncertainty facing them when they leave. And for me, I went back to Stanford and finished my PhD, and then went on to my academic career. So yeah, I keep saying this, but I really, it's just so obvious to me. I was so fortunate to be, in this playing in the circumstances in which I was playing. They were possible because of the generation that I was part of, possible because of my family, possible because of the schools, and the whole environment that I lived in. I didn't have to plot this thing out against all the odds or anything like that. I just had to go with what I had sort of grown up understanding made sense.
Now, after you were cut from the Chiefs, you spent, I believe, a season or half a season with the Canadian football team, the Tiger Cats.
Yeah. I got a call. I went home. I was angry, of course, and this is something I'd done for 18 of the first 26 years of my life, and it had ended prematurely and in an ugly way. Being cut from the team under circumstances that didn't make much sense to me. And so when I got a call from the team in Canada, the Hamilton Tiger Cats, I jumped on it. It gave me an opportunity to walk out on my own 2 feet rather than at the end of somebody's boot, So I played out the season. They start their season earlier because their winters come earlier. And so I played, I think, 9 games in Hamilton, and, was kind of the stud offensive lineman in a way. And that was sort of gratifying to my bruised ego at the end. But basically what it allowed me to do was to stop when I was ready to stop rather than when somebody else told me. I could have continued playing in Canada had I chosen to, but at that point, what would be the point?
Right.
All I had to do was finish my dissertation, and I could go about my lifelong business.
Do you think that going out on your own terms also made you not feel bitter towards the game after you had left?
I suspect it helped a lot. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how embittered I would be. When I finished in Canada and went back to Stanford and then to Oregon State for my first job, I didn't watch much football for several years, but I didn't feel estranged from it or angry at it or alienated from it. I just done it so long, at the highest level, playing with my teammates in Kansas City, that what I saw on TV just wasn't very interesting to me. It just didn't pull me in. And maybe I was protecting myself, my fragile ego a little bit. I don't know. But I wasn't bitter. I was just, relatively uninterested in the game at that point. But had it ended before Canada, maybe my ego would have been a little more bruised, my feelings a little stronger.
Mm-hmm.
It was a nice way to go out.
Yeah. Now, to sort of switch to a little bit of football in the media and some of the topics you touched on King Football. First, football, it doesn't have the vast library of fiction work, say like baseball or boxing or some other sports. But are there any books or short stories or any stories from those old pulp novels that really stand out to you as great reads? Some of your favorites pertaining to football?
You mean stories that ordinary citizens would like rather than professors of English?
Oh, both.
Yeah. Well, there's a famous short story by a guy named Irwin Shaw called The 80-Yard Run from 1941 in Esquire, I think it was, about the aging football player. Christian Darling, who back in college, he was in practice. He had the spectacular 80-yard run. And then his life, was a long decline after that. That's kind of one of the classic motifs in American sports, the aging athlete and the former athlete trapped in his youth and all that sort of thing. I think this was kind of a bigger part of the culture when I was in school and coming out of football and so on, because it's something I was very much aware of avoiding, not becoming one of these guys, or not becoming the 40-year-old guy who goes down to the bar on Friday nights in the fall and can do nothing but talk about, his junior year in high school, when he scored that touchdown, and
right.
Yeah. So Erwin Shaw's 80-yard run is one of those. More recently, there's a very wonderfully strange novel called End Zone by Don DeLillo, who's a very well-known writer, and End Zone is not as well known as some of his other novels, but it's just really, really interesting. There's a handful of kind of semi-classic football texts, and then a lot of just formula stories, generic stories, some of which are fun and mostly interchangeable. There's a guy, my favorite writer right now is a guy named James Hopper, who played football at Cal in the 1890s, and then went on and wrote, 15, 20 football stories about it. And it's about the experience of somebody playing back, when the game was so strangely not like it is today and so on. But I don't know that would have much popular interest with readers today.
Yeah, I have two magazines. It's like Football Action, and I think maybe it's just called Football, from the 40s and 50s. And there was one story. It's kind of like the motif of, like, the mobster tries to get him to throw a game. That conventional narrative, and somehow, like, he gets out of it, and there's like a damsel in distress, some sort of femme fatale also in there. I can't remember what that one was called, it was called Fourth Quarter Hellion. They had great names too. Yeah, and then there's another one called like the Lost 11, which follows a freshman football team and sort of like their journey together, through their senior year of college. And that one was a pretty interesting one. But it is interesting how a lot of them just seem to repeat the same, formula over and over again, because it's not like Western or, like detective, where you can have like a little bit of a variety. Whereas like football, you're kind of a team, and there's only so many ways you could tell that one story, or in that same setting.
Yeah. And the thing is, to have a story, you need to have a hero.
Yeah.
And your hero has to triumph, but he has to triumph over obstacles, and he probably has to lose somewhere along the way. So one of the challenges for writers is, so how do you get this perfect hero of yours to screw up, or to somehow, have to overcome, the shame of the, so gamblers and gangsters was one of the ways to do it. You just kidnap him, keep him out of the big game, because you kidnap him, and then he shows up and scores the winning touchdown, and so that works. So that's how those gamblers and gangsters got into a lot of those stories.
Yeah. I think that was the plot in Bonzo Goes to College.
Yeah. Oh yeah. The football movies do the same thing that the stories do. Yeah. What
about football movies? Are there any that stick out to you?
Well, there's some really funky 1930s college football musicals that are mostly mediocre, but in really interesting ways. And the best of them is called Rise and Shine, from about 1941, and it's from the James Thurber story, based on his being an undergraduate student at Ohio State in the early 30s, and the football star in his story is a guy named Boley Belenkowitz. So you can imagine that he's big and dumb, right?
Uh-huh.
and he has to pass his exams in order to be eligible for the big game, and the whole thing. It's just a hoot. But in general, both with movies and with books, and some of this from having read King Football, what's really interesting is the cast of characters that get into these things over and over again, the conventional characters. So like Bully Balankowitz is the dumb jock, and we're so familiar with the stereotype of the dumb jock. Where did the dumb jock come from? College football is football played by young men at college, So how did the image of the dumb jock come in? Well, part of it was that kind of racist, anti-ethnic bias in the 20s and 30s where anybody named Balankowitz, Polish or Irish or Italian or whatever, was considered, lesser and all that. And so,
right.
Once these guys start going to college, then it becomes possible to have the stereotype of the dumb jock, and they're usually comic figures, but, there's kind of a little bit of nastiness underlying them. The big booster. I mean, boosters, we live in this world of NIL today that's just out of control, but it's just going back to the 30s when things were out of control, and the big booster was funding everything. You never read about big boosters on the sports pages. You read about them in the stories, in the magazines, and at the movies and all.
Well, did you ever see Saturday's Hero?
Oh yeah.
That's like one of the few movies that actually touches on that topic and does so like not in a comic way, because like a lot of the movies you're talking about from like the 30s and 40s, it's like a musical or a whimsical. Like they don't want to be too serious with it, but this was like, at least to my knowledge, the only movie of that like black and white period that actually looked at college football and sort of the corruption underneath it in a very serious way.
Yeah, and it was based on a novel by a guy named Miller Lampell, who was one of the blacklisted screenwriters. He was a leftist. So exposing corruption in college football was a leftist conspiracy back in 1939. That's why there weren't others. In the theaters and in the bookstores.
Yeah, well, it's also a good movie too, because like sometimes football action in those movies aren't really all that believable. But that was actually one that actually did show like good choreographed action as well. And Jim Thorpe, All-American dude, does a pretty well-known job too. And especially because like Thorpe played in the early, like 1906, 7, and they were pretty accurate with how they kind of conveyed football action back then, like the checkered fields and things of that nature too.
But you could not film real football action with the real collisions and so on. Yeah. Because, you got actors doing it. There's liability and all. The movie actually that I remember as the first thing, oh my goodness, that's the real thing, was North Dallas 40, which is like 1974. And they have this one scene where it's just a head-on collision that's just an explosion, like you see in actual football games. But this was filmed, and that's pretty recent from my perspective, 1974. But that's the first movie that I really remember having football action that looked like football.
Did you ever see Number One with Charlton Heston?
Yeah, long time ago.
I've talked to, because sometimes I review movies on the show, and people always, from what I read back then, they didn't really buy him as an NFL quarterback. But to me, when you look at like a picture of Tom Brady at 40, and then you look at Daryl LaMonica or George Blanda when they were playing, like to me, it's believable that a guy that looked like Charlton Heston could be like an NFL quarterback.
But what defeats him is when they actually try to do what a quarterback does. I mean, it's not a simple thing for an actor to cock the ball and throw a pass and have it look like an actual quarterback throwing a pass. That's where they stumble. Yeah, he looked the part, but
didn't play the part. Yeah. Well, what I think would be a cool movie to see? Like, if have you ever seen Le Mans, the Steve McQueen movie? It's basically like the what?
A race
Yeah, it's supposed to be like a fictional documentary, but not like in the sense of like a mockumentary where they gave interviews. It just like has a camera on the Le Mans race that Steve McQueen is fictionally racing in. But there's like there's like a half hour in the beginning of the movie without any dialogue. So many stretches of the movie don't really have a plot. You're just watching a race unfold over the course of a couple of days, like a Le Mans event. And I think it would be cool to show like one game in the NFL, not necessarily today, but whether it was in the 40s, 50s, 60s, just to see how everything went down. Sort of from like multiple viewpoints going in and out. I think that would be really cool to see, like just football action from like a cinematic standpoint.
Yeah. I'm sure NFL Films has the archival footage to do this, but
right.
Yeah, somebody's got to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. How big was NFL Films on you with Facenda and Sable? Like, I guess you were in college when they really started putting out films and whatnot, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I wasn't much aware of them at all, or at least aware of them as this is NFL Films doing this stuff. I mean, I saw highlights and all that sort of thing, but I didn't become really aware of them and huge fans of the work they do until the 1990s when 1990s when I started writing, and early 2000 when I started writing about the NFL. And NFL Films, they don't do the same stuff today very much at all, but they were the epic poet of professional football. I mean, they created football larger than life. John Facenda's voice is God on high, and the way they did the weather and the coloring, the sound, and slow motion collisions and all that kind of stuff. It's really, really pretty extraordinary cinema. I met Sable a couple times, interviewed him for a documentary that I was helping a guy I knew do. His last interview, I believe, probably before he died. He was a classy guy. He agreed to this interview because I think basically because when the NFL was doing its 50th, what would it have been in 1995? 1995 doesn't make any sense.
It was the 75th anniversary?
Yeah, it does make sense. 75th anniversary. They did a program at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and invited me to be on a panel with Tex Schramm and I can't remember who else, and Steve Sable hosted it or, posed the questions and all that kind of stuff. And because I had, given my time to him for that, he gave his time to me for this interview. I thought that was really classy,
Yeah.
And the work he was doing there, and he had a guy working for him named Steve Seidman who was doing a lot of these films and just loved the old archival footage. They got me as one of the talking heads on a bunch of those things. I loved doing those things, and I loved, working with Steve Seidman as a kind of a colleague, sharing interest with this stuff, and Sable as well. I mean, I didn't have a close relationship with him, but I really respected the work they were doing.
Yeah. Well, and you could definitely tell watching those films that, he was someone that wasn't really just influenced by like highlight packages, like he was influenced by a lot of the movies that he saw from like either Kurosawa or Hitchcock. He really kind of took what he saw from those movies and tried to incorporate them in a sports highlight documentary package that's some, cross between all of those. You can't really like give a clear, distinct genre for what those movies are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I assume that work from NFL Films in the 90s and early 2000s is respected by film people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's
football.
Yeah, there's actually, I don't know if it's true or not, but there's sort of like that urban legend that Sam Peckinpah actually, when he was filming The Wild Bunch, was influenced by like the slow motion action from the football, close-ups and stuff like that, which would actually be really cool if that was the case.
Yeah, if it isn't true, it should be.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we'll make it true. Just a couple questions to close off here. To your point about NIL, the NCAA, and obviously with a lot of teams kind of leaving conferences that they've been in for so many years and kind of putting long-sticking rivalries potentially obsolete. Where do you kind of see like the cultural importance of college football going as more and more teams pretty much just go to these super conferences and NIL? You can have athletes coming and going from universities seemingly every year. Where do you kind of think this is all headed from a fan standpoint, and how it kind of connects to the university even?
Yeah, well, the real question is, will it connect to the university anymore? It is transformed beyond recognition. As somebody who is a beneficiary of the system, I resisted for a long time the idea that the players should be paid, but several years ago, I came around and realized, wait a minute. When you're paying coaches these millions of dollars, the only justification for not paying the players was if you're giving them a real, true college education that gives them access to a middle-class life when they're done playing football, then you can make the argument that you are paying them something comparable to what the dollars would be. But it's been so untrue for so long that that's what football players and men's basketball players were getting out of the agreement. An education and a middle-class life for the sake of your athletic services. But guess what? The education isn't a real education, or the whole story. And so I came around several years ago, like I say, to realizing the players had to be paid. But the ineptitude of the NCAA in handling that and figuring out some way to do it in a meaningful way, is just kind of mind-boggling. But it's too late now. College football players today have absolute free agency and absolute unlimited access to money, because they don't have a union like the Players Association. There would be no college draft or salary cap in the NFL if the NFLPA did not agree to those as necessary to the good of the overall operation, to the benefit of everyone. So now you have, a situation where individuals can just get whatever they want whenever they want it, as long as somebody's willing to give it to them. And I don't think that can be reversed.
Right.
As soon as you try to reverse that, as soon as you try to cap, say, NIL, all you got to do is have one player sue, and it gets thrown out because of a violation of his workers' rights and all that. If the players were unionized, then they could negotiate this stuff. But how do you unionize players that are around for 4 years, 5 years? So I don't see how this is going to be capped in any meaningful way. Which means then, of course, that the teams that can guarantee the most money and all that, So maybe what we're moving toward is the kind of super conference you were alluding to. It won't be 60 teams; it'll be smaller than that, maybe half that. But in the meantime, all of the traditional rivalries and old alignments will have completely disappeared. Now when I say traditional, I remind myself I'm 74 years old. My sense of what a tradition is not what your sense of a tradition is, probably, even, let alone a 20-year-old today and all that. So my guess is the loss of tradition is more deeply felt the older you are. The longer you think those traditions have been around. But actually, the traditions I'm aware of, the four major bowl games, that didn't come in until the 50s when I came in.
Sure.
So it's not as if it's around forever. So where it goes, who knows? But I'm at Oregon. I'm a retired professor from Oregon State University. How is Oregon State University going to compete in this world? Corvallis, Oregon, a town of 50,000. Where's the NIL coming from here? Down the road, University of Oregon has big bucks Phil Knight, to take care of things. But that's an anomaly. That's a one-time deal. What's going to happen to the Pac-12? How are Cal and Stanford going to accept, Boise State and San Diego State as peer institutions? College, football conferences, were part of university relations more generally. Institutions came together as like-minded institutions. So what is the Pac-12 going to do now that it's lost its LA schools? I don't know what's going to happen there. It's just going to be utter chaos, Wild West, like everybody's saying for a while. But I don't know how you cap the Wild West. And so there's going to have to be some kind of Darwinian shakeup of the whole operation. And I don't know who's going to come out on top. I keep thinking about those SEC schools. They're not in big media markets. They're in big football markets. But, are they going to remain on top forever, or is somehow, the sports media going to drag things, to LA and New York? I don't know, but it's going to be a real mess for a long time. And I think a lot of, Oregon State is completing a $160 million remodel of its football stadium, which will seat 35,000 when it's done. So it's going to have $160 million more of bonded indebtedness. There are institutions all over the country, that are paying off their stadiums. So what happens when they can't fill their stadiums anymore? What happens when the TV revenue doesn't, fill in for they can't fill their stadium? It's going to get really messy in a whole variety of different ways around the country.
Yeah, well, it kind of goes to the point in your book, when you mention like the big stadiums, it's kind of like, with the rise of cable and now with even streaming, it's like, football kind of went from being a little bit of like a mythology to being just pure entertainment now, where you just can't escape it. That's played not really by heroes, but by celebrities now,
Yeah, exactly. I cringe when I see Bryce Young in one of these TV commercials. This is a sophomore quarterback at Alabama, in these commercials. And I'm thinking, so he puts in so many hours on football that he doesn't have enough to be a truly, committed student. But now he's got to put in money on marketing himself, and he's just, kind of an extreme case because he's so visible doing this on these national commercials. But what are these kids going to do, when they're trying to balance classes, football, and branding themselves and marketing themselves and, meeting the expectations of their sponsors and so on? It's
going to present a whole new set of issues.
Yeah. And again, I'll repeat what I said over and over from the beginning. I am so glad to be old, to have been through a simpler world that I went through.
Yeah. I envy you in a lot of ways that way. What about like last question, like future projects? Do you have anything in the works or anything that you'd like to get to?
Well, in retirement, I no longer teach and go to meetings, but I can keep writing. And I finished one book a few years ago, a kind of labor of love, a picture book called The Art of, with all of these images, from the 1890s up to the 20s when things are still in the public domain and I don't have to pay fees to reproduce them. And there's some just wonderful, football art from those years. And so that was fun. And what I'm working on now is a book about, we haven't talked about this in the program, but we all know that what's hanging over football is CTE. And what we're going to do when we know more about, what causes it and what are the chances and all that kind of stuff. And so it's made me think about the violence in football for a long, long time. Toughness was being able to withstand the violence, but, there are limits to how much toughness you want to have if you want to, keep your sense. So anyway, so I'm writing a book about, the role of violence in boxing and football, and just trying to figure it out, trace it through, through books and movies and sports writing and magazine articles and all that kind of stuff. And it's something that gives me something to do when I get up in the morning. and I don't have to go off to the university and actually work at a job.
Yeah. Well, that's going to be interesting because I've kind of wondered like about the modern fan. Like, does the modern fan really gravitate to football a lot simply for the toughness and the hard hits like they did 10 or 15 years ago? Or is a part of it just like the offensive spectacle and the artistry that goes into the game more so than it did, a decade or two ago?
Yeah, well, I mean, the fundamental tension in football is between artistry and violence, And the way I would always explain it, say to a group of students, just picture a wide receiver going up to catch a pass at the same time that the defensive back slams into him. There it is. There's the artistry, the pass and the catch, and there's the violence. And one without the other would not be so powerful. Just a guy running down the field and catching the ball, big deal, or just somebody hitting somebody, big deal. But somebody hitting a person at the moment of balletic artistry, what's going to come out of that?
Right.
You want the guy to hang on to the ball, and that makes his accomplishment that much more impressive, and that's what football is all about. Now, between the two, what do fans prefer, the artistry or the violence? Everybody likes some of both, but some probably like one kind more than the other kind. It used to be said that women like the artistry of football and men like the violence. It's not that simple. It's not that simple.
Yeah, I agree.
But when I watch NFL football today, it doesn't seem tame. The game is still plenty rough and violent and all that. The question is it still too violent? And we won't know that until we can diagnose CTE in living tissue. Once the scientists figure that one out, then we're going to know a whole lot more about just how much violence is possible to have in football.
Yeah, Jack Tatum used to have, in his autobiography, he had a suggestion where if you want to cut down on injuries, get rid of zone coverage and just have everyone play man-to-man, which is an interesting concept, frankly, but like you kind of wonder, would that actually kind of help things because you don't have someone that's going to lay a guy out when he's coming across the middle or on like a shallow cross or something like that?
Yeah, and Jack Tatum is not exactly the guy who you want to trust him. You want to make the game safe enough. What you do, you just take off the helmets.
Right.
As soon as you take off the helmets, guys will protect their own faces and heads.
Yeah.
But you won't have football. You won't have American football. You'll have something more like rugby again. And been there, done that, and didn't like it way back in the early 20th century. And so
we can have guys could just be wearing nose guards again.
Yeah,
that would be cool. Michael, this was a pleasure to have you on the show. I really enjoy your books and I enjoyed talking to you, and I'm really grateful you gave us so much of your time. So thank you, and I'm really looking forward to reading your work when it comes out.
Okay. Yeah, good to talk to you, Aron.